What happens when you put good people in an evil place? Does the situation triumph over the individual, or does our inherent goodness shine through? Today, we're diving deep into one of the most controversial and ethically debated psychological studies of all time, the Stanford prison experiment. This story is a chilling reminder of how easily the lines between right and wrong can blur. It all started in 1971. The U.S. Navy was having a tough time understanding the conflicts erupting in its prisons and within the Marine Corps. They turned to a young psychologist at Stanford University, Philip Zimbardo, for answers. Zimbardo devised an experiment to simulate prison life and see how people would react to the roles they were given. The plan was to run this simulation for 2 full weeks. To find participants, they placed a simple ad in the local newspaper. It offered $15 a day, a decent sum back then, for a 2-week study on prison life. Over 70 people applied, mostly young, white, middle-class college students on their summer break. From this pool, Zimbardo and his team carefully screened and selected the 24 individuals they deemed the most psychologically stable and physically healthy. These were ordinary, everyday young men, with no history of crime or psychological issues. They were the cream of the crop, the good apples. The experiment began with a coin toss, literally. These 24 healthy young men were randomly assigned their roles. Half would become prisoners, the other half, guards. The basement of the Stanford psychology department was transformed into a makeshift prison. Hallways became the prison yard, and small lab rooms were converted into cells. A senior lab assistant took on the role of the warden, and Zimbardo himself served as the overall superintendent. The stage was set. Now let's talk about the uniforms, because they were more than just costumes. They were tools of transformation. The guards were given military-style khaki uniforms, which they actually picked out themselves from a local surplus store. They also got wooden batons, not for use, but as a symbol of power, and mirrored sunglasses. Those sunglasses were a crucial detail. They prevented any eye contact, creating a barrier of anonymity and making the guards feel less like individuals and more like a unified, faceless authority. They were scheduled to work in 8-hour shifts and could go home afterward, though as we'll see, many soon volunteered for unpaid overtime. The prisoners, on the other hand, were systematically stripped of their identity. They were forced to wear ill-fitting smocks, like dresses, with no underwear. This was intentionally designed to make them feel emasculated and awkward in their own bodies. On their feet, they had uncomfortable rubber sandals. They had to wear tight nylon stocking caps over their hair, meant to simulate the head shaving that new military recruits go through. Around one ankle, a small chain was locked. It wasn't heavy, but it was a constant physical reminder that they were not free. Most importantly, their names were taken away. They were no longer John or Mark. They were numbers, sewn onto their smocks. They were to be referred to only by their number. The day before the experiment officially began, the guards were brought in for a briefing. Their instructions were vague. They were told their job was to maintain a reasonable degree of order within the prison. They could run their shifts however they saw fit. The only explicit rule was a big one: no physical violence. Zimbardo essentially told them, "It's your prison. You're responsible for it." He wanted to see what kind of prison they would create on their own. Meanwhile, the young men assigned to be prisoners were told to just wait at home. They had no idea what was coming next. On a quiet Sunday morning, without any warning, the silence was shattered by the sound of police sirens. Real police officers from the Palo Alto Police Department, who had agreed to cooperate with the experiment, pulled up to their homes. They were arrested in full view of their neighbors, charged with armed robbery, handcuffed, and read their rights. They were then put in the back of a police car and taken to the station. This wasn't a simulation anymore. This felt terrifyingly real. At the police station, they went through the complete humiliating process of being booked. They were fingerprinted, had their mugshots taken, and were placed in a holding cell. From there, they were blindfolded and transported to the Stanford County Prison, the psychology department basement. Upon arrival, the real indoctrination began. Each prisoner was systematically stripped naked, searched, and then sprayed with a delousing agent to cleanse them. Their personal belongings were taken away. They were given their numbered smocks, and their new identities were cemented. The guards were waiting for them. The transformation was astonishingly fast. Within hours, the participants were no longer just college students playing a game. They were guards and prisoners. The guards quickly began to assert their authority, and some started to enjoy it a little too much. They made the prisoners do push-ups as punishment for minor infractions, often with a guard stepping on their backs. They would wake the prisoners up in the middle of the night for counts, where prisoners had to recite their numbers over and over, a tactic designed to drill their new identity into their minds and create a sense of disorientation. On the second day, the prisoners rebelled. They ripped off their stocking caps, tore the numbers from their smocks, and barricaded themselves inside their cells using their beds. How did the guards respond? Remember, no physical violence was allowed. But they found other ways. They blasted the rebels with a fire extinguisher, broke into the cells, stripped the prisoners naked, took their beds away, and put the ringleaders into solitary confinement, a tiny, dark closet. The guards then employed a classic psychological tactic. They created a privilege cell. They gave 3 of the less involved prisoners their uniforms and beds back, and even gave them special food to eat in front of the other starving prisoners. This quickly broke the solidarity among the inmates. They started to distrust each other, believing some were informants. The rebellion was crushed. The situation began to spiral downwards at an alarming rate. The guards became increasingly authoritarian and, in some cases, sadistic. 1/3 of the guards began to exhibit genuine cruelty. They would deny prisoners the right to use the toilet, forcing them to use a bucket in their cell, which they then refused to let them empty. The verbal abuse was relentless. They created games of humiliation, all under the guise of maintaining order. The psychological toll on the prisoners was immense. Prisoner Thubber 8612 started to suffer from acute emotional distress. He was screaming, crying, and raging. He begged to be released. Initially, Zimbardo and his staff thought he was just faking it to get out. They offered him a deal, become an informant, and they'd be nicer to him. He refused. It was only when his breakdown became so severe that they realized it was real. They had to release him just 36 hours into the experiment, but the abuse continued for those who remained. During a visit from parents, the guards cleaned up the prison and played nice, fooling the visitors into thinking everything was fine. After the parents left, the guards escalated their cruelty, angry that the prisoners hadn't shown them in a worse light. A rumor of an escape plot led the guards to dismantle the entire prison and move it to another floor, only to find out the rumor was false. The paranoia was palpable on both sides. A Catholic priest, a friend of Zimbardo's, was brought in to evaluate how realistic the setup was. When he interviewed the prisoners, he asked them what they were doing to get out. They replied with their prisoner numbers and talked about getting a lawyer. They had become so lost in their roles that they forgot they were participants in an experiment who could leave at any time. The turning point came from an unlikely source. Christina Maslach, a recent Stanford PhD and Zimbardo's girlfriend at the time, was brought in to conduct interviews. On the evening of the 5th day, she walked down to the basement and saw the guards marching the prisoners, bags over their heads, to the toilet, shouting and degrading them. She was horrified. She confronted Zimbardo later that night, telling him, "What you are doing to these boys is a terrible thing." Her objection was the wake-up call Zimbardo needed. He had become so engrossed in his role as prison superintendent that he had lost his objectivity as a research psychologist. He couldn't see the suffering he was causing. The next morning, on only the 6th day of a planned 2-week study, the Stanford prison experiment was terminated. The aftermath was profound. The participants were brought together for debriefing sessions to process what had happened. Many of the guards expressed shock at their own behavior, unable to believe they were capable of such cruelty. The prisoners were left with emotional scars. The experiment, while a failure in terms of longevity, was a shocking success in demonstrating its hypothesis that powerful situations can overwhelm individual personalities and morals. Good people, placed in a toxic environment, can be pushed to do terrible things. The Stanford prison experiment remains a landmark study, but it's also a cautionary tale about the ethics of research and the dark potential that lies within us all. It forces us to ask ourselves, if we were in that basement, would we have been the cruel guard, the broken prisoner, or the person who finally said, "Stop"? Thank you so much for watching. This is a heavy topic, and it raises a lot of important questions. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. What do you think this experiment says about human nature? If you found this video thought-provoking, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more deep dives into the human mind. See you next time.